Okay, we're going to get started here. My name is Tom Corbett. I'm the former governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Privileged to have that. See a number of friends here in the room. And with me I have Tom Woods, who is a assistant United States attorney from the Western District of Washington State. He came a long way for this presentation, so I appreciate your patience with us. Also, where's Mr. Engels? We need Mr. Engels on here.
There he is.
Chris, right?
Yeah.
Chris Engels is a reporter for KING, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. King TV, yep.
In TV. Can't you tell he looks like he is at this point in time? And the two of them have had a very interesting few years dealing with a far-right, I'm going to say neo-Nazi hate group. And I'm going to turn it over right now to Tom to begin the discussion. But it's a group I had never heard about before I got involved with this. Atomwaffen, which means?
Atomic weapon in German.
And go ahead.
Yeah, and they sprung on the scene in 2017 under circumstances that you just really can't make up. In May of 2017, an individual was waving a gun, threatening to take people hostage. When he was approached by police, the good news was he had not harmed anybody where he was. The bad news was he had confessed to law enforcement that he had murdered 2 of his roommates. This was Devin Arthurs. Devin Arthurs was a longtime neo-Nazi who was living with 3 other neo-Nazis and curiously became a radical Islamist and was convinced that his 2 roommates, these neo-Nazis, were going to be planning mass attacks in the United States, targeting infrastructure and causing mass violence. And allegedly, according to him, he killed them to stop. Agents...
that took place where?
In Tampa, Florida, in 2017. And so agents executed a warrant, and sure enough, they found a 4th roommate who had bomb-making equipment. He had a framed photo of Timothy McVeigh in his room. He had all sorts of Nazi paraphernalia. And so was born Atomwaffen in terms of at least the law enforcement consciousness. It's an organization that, as the focus was on it, that was committed to the belief that the structure of the United States had to be destroyed, and that there was going to be an upcoming race war, and that these individuals should take steps to precipitate that race war by engaging in mass acts of violence and destruction. And in the wake of these murders, an individual by the name of Caleb Cole, we're going to talk about a lot during the session, became one of the de facto leaders of Atomwaffen. And as part of this group, they primarily were able to organize and did their organization online using encrypted chat services and other encrypted apps to have their communications throughout the country and throughout the world. They were a secretive organization that used monikers, so they would not use their real names. We're going to talk about in a minute why that was so important. And so they would use, these monikers to try to mask their identities. And they were unfortunately very good and very effective at promoting themselves. And we have an example of one of the promotional videos that they did. I'll just warn folks, although there's no racial epithets in the video, there are disturbing images of violence. If we could cue the video, please.
What year was this?
So that was in 2018, roughly, is when these videos were put out. And there's sort of two things I think that are of note. The first is the scenes that you saw there were filmed during training camp sessions. They call them hate camps, without any irony, throughout the country that they hosted, in which they would practice combat training, talk about operational security, and also plan for whatever their future was going to be. And then the second thing you saw is that cryptic address on the bottom, the internet address. Initially they promoted their videos and their propaganda on public sites like Facebook. They were kicked off and ultimately used the dark websites to disseminate their propaganda, and again, coordinated using these encrypted chats. And we're going to talk in a minute about Chris's excellent and important reporting about this group, and then ultimately what gets him ensnared in this group. But Chris, initially, do you want to talk about the work that ProPublica did and how important that was?
Sure. Hello, everyone from Seattle. And Governor, just like you, I had never heard of this group called Atomwaffen. I couldn't say it right or anything like that.
Me neither.
But I did get a tip that the FBI here in the Seattle area was looking into this group and looking at the possibility of getting a extreme risk protection order against one of the leaders of the group, which we can talk about later. But that's the thing that sort of got my news juices flowing. And then even more so, as Tom said, when you read about this group, the extreme lunacy behind their philosophy and the really frightening real world reality that they're preparing to carry this out with firearms, all of it happening here in Washington State. So I heard about Atomwaffen, I looked him up, and the investigative online website ProPublica had done some excellent reporting on the Atomwaffen division, sort of detailing how the group responded, because it's clear that that ProPublica had somebody inside the group who was supplying them with information in these various chat groups. Again, the members of Atomwaffen are located throughout the country, including here in Washington, and they're really talking to each other via internet chats. And so somehow ProPublica got some of the inside information that these members, what they were saying to each other when a gay Jewish college student was murdered in California by a member of Atomwaffen. And so, and then you just start reading about this group that believes in, they're neo-Nazis, they believe in Hitler. The other driving force behind their philosophy is the 1960s mass murderer Charles Manson, who's sort of legendary for just horrible crimes he committed, I believe in 1969, most notably the American actress Sharon Tate was murdered by his group and the LaBianca family. They wrote "Death to Pigs" in on the wall in the LaBianca home. Just a terrible group, but Manson's twisted thought was, we're going to try to pin these murders on minority groups, and whites will rise up to fight back, and we'll be ready to join this fight. And that's really what Atomwaffen is all about. They were preparing for a race war that they believed was coming, and they were doing it here in Washington State. I was able to watch some of those, get a hold of some of those videos on BitChute, and could recognize some of the places in Washington State where they were training with these hate camps. So for us, it was a big story here in Seattle and in Washington State.
If we could cue up the PowerPoint. So needless to say, they got our attention. And the de facto leader, or at least one of the de facto leaders of Atomwaffen that emerged after these bizarre murders that occurred in Tampa, was Caleb Cole, who is based in a town called Arlington, which is about an hour and a half north of Seattle. And Cole was instrumental in two facets of the organization. The first is he traveled overseas to try to forge ties with extremist groups. And you can see this horrific image of him with one of his fellow Atomwaffen members in front of the gates of Auschwitz. And he traveled in Europe, met with a lot of fringe groups, and tried to build an organization that was broader than the United States.
Which one's Cole?
Cole is the individual that is on the right. My
With the
right.
hat.
My right.
Okay.
Yes, with the hat. And then, as Chris alluded to, and the second thing he was doing was organizing these hate camps and getting out the promotional videos. As Chris alluded to, what was so terrifying about Caleb Cole was he had an arsenal of weapons, and he's repeatedly appearing in these videos and promoting these videos of mass violence. Washington State, at the time, was one of the few states, this has been a growing number, that has a red flag law. So a law that allows law enforcement to petition a court in a civil manner to say that someone has posed an extreme risk to public safety and that their firearms need to be seized. And so the FBI, in coordination with the Seattle Police Department, approached our county prosecuting office, King County Prosecutor's Office, to petition for one of these red flag law actions, which we refer to as an extreme risk protection order, an ERPO. And that was served, and as you can see, these firearms and accessories, some of which were untraceable ghost guns and ghost gun parts, were seized. And this really is where Chris is reporting, and Chris's role in the story really takes hold. Chris, do you want to talk about the reporting you did on this?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the tip that I received was that the FBI was coming to local authorities seeking to have somebody, I didn't know who, that was under investigation, a white supremacist, to be subject to a civil court order to remove his firearms. This was highly unusual because this is a mechanism that local prosecutors use, but how often do the feds come knocking on their door and say, hey, this guy, we think he's at risk enough to the public that we think you should take his firearms. And so as you see the picture on the screen, those are the firearms that Caleb Cole had in his possession that were seized as a result of this civil order by a judge that this guy constitutes a public threat after the FBI and the police presented this information, to that state court judge. On a number of fronts, this was all very interesting to me. I got a treasure trove of information from the court records related to that extreme risk protection order hearing, and that's the first time we went on the air with that story about why the feds wanted his firearms, why they thought he was a risk, and the whole story about Atomwaffen. And then the following day, I made my first attempt to try to find Caleb Cole. I had no way of reaching him. He had no criminal history, and he didn't have a lot of public information available on where he might be. And the court records included one address in Arlington, Washington. And that's where I ended up going the next day just to try to get Cole's side of the story. And a woman came to the door. I assumed it was his mother. That was the first time that I really recognized that this was probably his parents' house or a family member's house. He never responded to me. And we put a couple of stories on the air at that point about Cole, his firearms, and Atomwaffen.
Chris, how old was he at this time?
Yeah, Governor, he's a young guy. He's 22. All the members in this organization, for people who are so shockingly full of hate, are very young, teens to 20s, I would say.
Thank you.
So in the wake of this extreme risk protection order where Cole's firearms and arsenal is seized, he hightails it out to Texas. So he leaves with one of his co-conspirators, one of the other members of Atomwaffen, leaves the Washington area, thinks that it's just getting too hot, and drives down to Texas. While he's in Texas, he's stopped by a Texas police officer who finds in the car 4 additional firearms and 2,000 rounds of ammunition, which admittedly, or at least according to the other Atomwaffen member, belonged to him as opposed to Cole. but of course that's also alarming. And what's becoming very concerning for us on the law enforcement side is this group is getting angry. This ProPublica piece, which exposed the true identities of so many of the key Atomwaffen members. Remember, they're using these monikers on these encrypted chats. They've been leaked somehow to ProPublica, who has been able to unmask many of the true identities of these individuals. You have Chris's excellent reporting, putting a spotlight on this hate group, going to Caleb Cole's home, putting in the news that we have this person in the Washington area who is part of this dangerous hate group. And now you have the seizure, too. One of the firearms under the red flag law, and then second from this traffic stop. And that made a already dangerous situation even more combustible. And that kind of brings us to the criminal case and the criminal plot that unfolded. If we could switch.
Before you go, the firearms, were they legally purchased?
So they were legally purchased. There was not anything in his arsenal that was illegal to possess. They were all semi-automatic, legally purchased in a variety of different ways, as far as we could tell. So what happens is we get this message, which we're going to see in two parts, from this individual named Crocodile. And this appears a little blurry, and that is what it is, because this is coming from one of those encrypted chats. And you can see here, he writes that we are coordinating this nationwide operation called Operation Earth Sol. That means first pillar. Named after the first pillar of state power, aka the media. We will be postering journalists' houses and media buildings to send a clear message that we too have leverage over them and that we aren't scared of their articles or public defamation. The goal, of course, is to erode the media state's air of legitimacy by showing people they have names and addresses and hopefully embolden others to act as well. And then there's a question. The good news about this message, it was sent to an informant. So there was an informant that the FBI managed to place in this group, who in turn was able to introduce, in certain aspects, an undercover officer as well. He was never able to infiltrate the group quite the same way that the informant did. And so the informant was able to send the FBI in real time these messages that were being sent to coordinate this operation. And the messages were concerning. It was an effort to retaliate against the media for what they felt was exposing them and their true identities. And the goal was, as you can see here, to locate activists, journalists, those who had shown a spotlight on this conduct. And here is, some of the chatter that you see. And I want to talk about that in a minute. And we're getting that in real time. But trying to figure out exactly, the scope of this was concerning. Were we getting all the messages? Was the informant really privy to everything that was happening? What is the point that law enforcement is going to intervene? When is the line being crossed from the First Amendment to criminal activity? These are all things that we're dealing with. And as you saw in that very first message, the goal here was to track down the homes, not the businesses, the homes of all of these individuals, and to make them feel scared. So this culminates in January of 2019, where the informant managed to get a meeting with Caleb Cole and the informant. And the great thing about this meeting is that when the informant knocked on the front door of Caleb Cole's house, as a joke, he said, "FBI, it's a raid." which of course was true at some level.
Macabre humor.
And Cole invited him in, and they had a discussion on video, because of course there was a recording device that was being worn by the undercover, about aspects of the plot, and to have no illusions about who Caleb Cole was and what his agenda was. That's what he wore in the meeting. So he was not hiding what was happening. But nonetheless, we were very concerned about, do we have the scope of what was happening? What should we be doing? And it started to become clear that this operation was going to be happening sometime towards the end of January. But who is involved? How many states were going to be involved? Who are the specific victims? This was all, not entirely clear. And so we made the very difficult decision on the law enforcement side to, even though this operation was unfolding, even though we had a covert criminal investigation, we felt a duty and an obligation to talk to the potential victims that we knew about. And Chris, why don't you take that over, that piece?
Yes, Tom, and I, for one, am very thankful that you made that decision. And I have to say, in 35 years of reporting, this was a moment that really stood out for me. I got a phone call when I was at work, and actually I took the phone call in this very room that I'm in right now, and a spokesperson from the United States Attorney's Office, who I've known for a long time, said, can you come to our office right now? We need to talk. And I could tell by the tone in her voice that something gravely serious was going on. And I didn't even say, what do you need? I just said, I'll be there in 10 minutes. And I excused myself from a meeting that was in the room next door, and I got out of there. And so, I was informed by two FBI agents, during the meeting that was occurring maybe 20, 25 minutes later, that I was being targeted by Atomwaffen. And they couldn't say for certain what was going to happen, because this is an unpredictable group, right? But they believed that members of Atomwaffen could be coming to my house as early as that weekend. And so this whole thing kind of washed over me. As a reporter, you sometimes get threats, you get people calling you names, bad things happen to you every now and then. This was the first time a law enforcement agency, much less the FBI, ever contacted me and said, hey, Ingalls, you ought to know about this. We want you to be aware about this. So as it did wash over me, I was like, I got to get my wife and kids the hell out of our house. And I was getting really scared at that point. Atomwaffen's warnings and their machinations were having their desired effect on me. I was scared. And I packed up my wife and our three kids, teenagers. One was a little bit younger, and we got them out of there and put them in a hotel. As soon as I told my boss about it, they put an armed security detail on us that was watching us. I mean, even though the FBI, I think they were trying to keep me from panicking, and they were, of course, very concerned that I would go on the air with this and blow their operation. I heard what they were telling me, that they didn't think anything was going to happen, but I knew enough about Atomwaffen and how crazy these guys were, that they might come by and throw a rock in my window, but one guy might decide that he's going to crawl through that window, And so I took what Tom and the FBI told me very seriously. This was a direct threat toward me, and I knew that life was going to be different for my family from there on.
So when, the weekend of when it appeared through the chats that this operation was going to happen, in Washington, at first glance, nothing happened. Now it's going to change, but seemingly we got through that day. I got a call in the middle of the night from one of the FBI agents, and it's good news. There's no one who showed up at Chris's house. It seems like we're good. But then the reports continue to trickle in. If we could go back to the PowerPoint. And this poster was discovered on a journalist for a Jewish publication in the Phoenix area.
Phoenix, Arizona.
Phoenix, Arizona. And the thing that is so cruel about this poster, well, there's a lot, right? But one of the things that's so cruel, that you can see it's on a window. That's the window of Mala Blomquist's daughter's bedroom window. And you can see that image of the man. It's a little hard to see, but he's holding a Molotov cocktail, and it's a little blurry in the background, but that house is on fire. And your actions have consequences. Our patience has its limits. And then we've redacted it at the bottom, but that's Mala Blomquist's home address that's written on the bottom. So that happened in Phoenix. It turns out, as we were able to piece together the story as things went on, the individuals in Phoenix had also targeted the home of a black journalist as well, and something had spooked them, and so they weren't able to do that. Then we have this poster, and we're going to talk about Hillary Bernstein in a minute, but this identical poster was located on the window of the front of a house in Tampa, Florida, and it had the name of a journalist in the Tampa area who is Puerto Rican by descent and who had covered Charlottesville and a lot of other stories in this space. And as luck would have it, if that's the right way to phrase it, these people put it on the wrong house. And as also bad luck would have it, the house that they got accidentally, because they had the address wrong, was a black family who, as you can imagine, was understandably terrified by what they saw. I remember in particular sitting down with the prime person who found it, and she talked about not wanting to tell her father because she knew how upsetting it would be for him, that we're having this happen in 2020, and the life he had lived and what seemingly had been progress. It was awful. And the reporter was understandably incredibly shaken. She ultimately ended up leaving the profession, and she told me it was in part because of the events of this case and how upsetting it was. So you can see on this poster, we are watching, we are no one, we are everyone, we know where you live, do not fuck with us. And once again, you have the name of the person, the reporter's name was there, along with what they thought was her home address, tacked on the home. And then Washington, things started to happen, and Chris...
Washington State.
The Seattle area. Chris, do you want to... Let's first, before we cut to Chris, let's take a look at this poster and just kind of absorb it for a minute. We have two can play at this game. We have death to pigs. We're going to focus on that in a second. These people have names and addresses, and there's Chris's information at the bottom. And if you focus on that death to pigs phrasing there, that's not an accident. That is lifted from one of the Charles Manson murders. It's the same image. If you look at it, the font's the same. It's literally just lifted from it. And as we heard earlier, Chris had done reporting about the open ties between this Atomwaffen group and Charles Manson's ideology. And Chris, do you want to talk about how this poster came to you and what happened?
Yeah, there was the weekend where a member of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, this was a Seattle police officer who investigates terrorism crimes along with other police agencies in the FBI. He had stood watch outside my house on the night that Atomwaffen possibly would show up. That didn't happen, but I was told that something could still happen or something could come in the mail. And I don't know if it was a week and a half later. It was sometime later. There was a letter that arrived in the mailbox. It looked suspicious to me, and I called the FBI, and they said, bring it into our office. And they opened it, and they showed me the poster that Tom just showed you. I mean, it's dressed in all kinds of symbolism and is a top to bottom of the page threat to me. You saw the swastikas on there. You saw the guy with the TV haircut, the press badge, the suit. You probably, maybe you didn't see the little dollar sign on his lapel pin because, of course, I'm corporate media. I was surrounded by, in the image, I'm surrounded by people wearing their Atomwaffen masks, and they have their firearms, just like we saw in the training videos. That had my name, my address, my cell number on there. It said, "You have been visited by your local Nazis, death to pigs." I knew that statement well. I mean, all of this was saying to me, hey, buddy, we know exactly where you live, and we can come and get you at any time. And so when the FBI started interviewing me, I could tell they wanted to see if I thought this was a threat. And hell yeah, it was a threat. I mean, it scared me. It had its intended effect, as I said. I just want to say that I was targeted for what I do, right? Because anonymity is what these people need. And journalism was doing its part here and outing these people. Other victims were targeted for who they were. And I didn't really understand that as deeply until I met some of them at trial and afterwards. But, they were targeted for their race and religion, not just because they were necessarily a journalist. And that was a whole different level of fear for them. And I know how fearful I was, and I really feel for them. But I want to say thank you to everybody that's taking part in this summit, because outing these people, finding them and rooting them out is so important. And I think the people in this room are all about that. So I can't tell you how thankful I am for all of you.
And so there were 2 other victims in the Seattle area who were targeted. The current head of the ADL for the Pacific Northwest, and then the former head as well. And so we, in a few weeks later, executed warrants in the Tampa area, Phoenix, Houston, Seattle, and ultimately ended up charging 4 individuals: Caleb Cole, Cameron Shea. Cameron Shea was the individual crocodile that you saw right up in that first slide planning the operation. He was based in the Seattle area and was somebody who was key in organizing this group. And then the 2 prime people who put posters up in Phoenix and in Tampa. 3 of the individuals pled guilty. Caleb Cole did not. He went to trial. And Caleb Cole's defense at trial was the First Amendment. I was not particularly worried about that defense in this case, but it is something that in all of these cases, when we evaluate, the lens of can we charge something, is forefront in the analysis. And Caleb Cole in that video where we talked about, where he met the undercover and the informant, he actually showed a pretty good understanding of where the First Amendment line was. And he was joking, when he said, look, if you look at this other poster he's talking about, you can see I use the word should as opposed to will. So, for example, saying like, I should kill you, it's probably not a threat under the First Amendment. I will kill you is. And he talked about manipulating that language, and that's something we, as prosecutors and as law enforcement, struggle with in terms of where is that line crossed. Now here, where you're targeting someone's home, for goodness sake, in these images of Charles Manson and a Molotov cocktail and saying we're watching you and putting the person's home address, I felt pretty confident that the jury would conclude this was speech not protected under the First Amendment, and that the judge would come to that same conclusion, and that's what happened.
So Tom, what were the actual charges?
Yeah, so we brought first conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy to violate 3 statutes. So there's an interstate threat statute, which basically makes it a crime to send a threat from one state to another that involves a threat to injure someone. And then second, we call it the civil rights statute, but the formal title is federally protected activities, which is targeting someone because of their race or some other protected class to interfere with their employment. And clearly, that's what the message was. I mean, they were basically saying to Chris, stop reporting and pack up and go home. And then third, the cyber stalking statute, which is a more recent statute that's come on the books. It's actually traditionally thought of in the context of a domestic violence type situation where someone is harassing and targeting, a former, somebody who was formerly in a relationship. But when you looked at the statute, it fit these facts as well. And so we charged that as well. And the trial was, as a prosecutor, I think it's very important to be as fair as possible. And one of the things I really strive to do is to not let emotion show, at least until the closing argument. To just present the facts before the jury and let them make their own decision. And then closing, it's true that, there's more emotion. It was hard. It was hard to
control your emotions?
Yeah. The victim stories in this case were really hard to hear. The husband of the current head of the ADL, he testified at trial about the effects that this incident's had on him as time has gone on. And he talked about, one Saturday morning, boy, I could picture myself in his same shoes, where he was making pancakes with his young toddler daughter. And a man showed up at the front door who had a crew cut. He was white. And he just freaked out, just grabbed his daughter, clutched her, and started to move away until he realized, it was a delivery person. And, that you could just tell is a wound that he is going to carry, and he does carry. That's not over because of this case. It's something that is going to stick with him. Hillary Bernstein, whose name we saw before, she was one of the former heads of the ADL. She was visiting her grandkids in a different state, and she flew home at night. She lives alone. She's a widower. And she opened this envelope and found this horrible message. And what she talked about was, let's keep in mind when this occurred. This occurred in January of 2020. And she talked about how cruel it was during the pandemic to be trapped at home, to have your home be a place that you just don't feel safe in. That lack of security. And how she carried that with her, during those days in the pandemic where all of us were stuck at home, definitely. It was really an emotional trial. And I'd like to tell you that Caleb Cole, found, some change, something in his heart that would signal that he had understood after hearing this just deeply emotional testimony. And instead, he wrote to his someone after trial that he felt this was a persecution of him, and did not apologize at sentencing.
Chris, did you testify?
I did, and I, like Tom, I was struck by this guy's remorselessness. I was in the courtroom for sentencing, for the verdict coming in, and another victim who had traveled across the country was standing next to me, the first time I ever met her, and she was turned with her back to Cole because she could not face the guy in this room, even though he was 20 yards away from her. And I think Cole liked that. I think he got the intended effect from all of us, and that's pretty bone chilling. 3 of the 4 defendants that were charged by Tom in the Western District of Washington showed signs of remorse. One of them even did an interview with me before he checked into the Hotel Federal Prison, and said they were sorry, but not Cole. And so that experience of testifying, it was nerve-wracking. It really was. And I told the jury, I said, my family, it's not the same. I yell at my kids when they leave the garage door open. I yell at them for not setting the house alarm. I yell at them for not coming home on time. Things that parents try not to worry about or get too alarmed about. Had me very alarmed personally. And because Cole never said I'm sorry or I was wrong. For a long time, I'm going to be looking over my shoulder for that reason, because Caleb Cole may be back again.
What was the defense?
Yes, I mean, the defense, again, really just relied on this notion that somehow these posters were protected speech, that it wasn't what we call a, quote, true threat under the law, that, this was something where, for right or for wrong, this is the defense words, not mine, they felt that the media had unfairly targeted them, that they were allowed to sort of, strike back, not in a violent way, as they put it, not with guns or anything, but with a message of speech was their defense, which again the jury rejected, and the judge did as well. I do want to say one thing that Chris said. I want to piggyback on it. Chris said that one of the victims had her back turned to Cole. I want to credit the victims in this case. It was not easy, as you can see from Chris's words here today, to stand up to this man. It was not easy to come in with all the chatter that continued about this group and potential other followers and everything else. They all walked into that courtroom. And yeah, sure, I subpoenaed them, but I was only going to call folks who were willing to show up, and they all did. And they all took that stand, and they all told their stories. And, it was a deep reminder to me of the path that I chose to be in law enforcement and a prosecutor. Why I made those decisions was seeing the courage of these folks to come in and tell their stories. And the judge credited that as well. The judge ultimately sentenced Cole to 7 years, which was within what we call the guidelines, the range that the court considers. And the court had a number of comments, and Chris, you can talk about this as well, but the one that stuck with me was, what the court said is, when you have an assault on the press, that's an assault on the fabric of our democracy. It's an assault on, everything that is important about this country. The work of Chris to put a spotlight on hate and a spotlight on misconduct. And that's what Chris does day in and day out. Some of those stories about law enforcement, we'll take it. but that important, critical work and that value that was under threat by this group and by Caleb Cole, and ultimately that was, vindicated by this case and by the sentence.
Chris?
Yeah, the judge, Tom's right. The judge summed it up very as Judge Kuhnauer does. He spelled it at the end very nicely and succinctly, and that's right. I mean, anonymity. These people want anonymity so that a guy like Tom Woods and the FBI don't come after them. And the judge recognized, and thankfully the jury recognized, that was the case, because the First Amendment is a very powerful defense, I think. I wasn't as assured as Tom. Of course, I didn't have all the inside knowledge that he does, that the jury would necessarily go that way. I mean, what if there's a juror who thinks I'm making a big stink and I wasn't really threatened? I was just being a overly dramatic TV guy, I could see that happening. I could have seen that happening. But in the end, there was justice in this case, and I feel really good about that 7-year sentence for Cole. He deserves it.
So we talked earlier today to prep for this a little bit, and I hadn't thought of the question I'm about to ask you now. So here comes the curveball. When does he get released? That's part A.
Yeah, so in the federal system, you generally, there's always exceptions, but you generally serve all but 54 days per year. So someone whose math is much better than mine, I can't even do the restaurant tip. But it's, 54 days over that 7-year period, he will get off, but otherwise he's going to serve that time in federal custody.
So, and he's in a federal prison, which I would assume is at least a medium, if not higher ranked prison.
Yeah, I think it's a medium facility, and it is not in the Seattle area. It's somewhere else in the country.
My question is anybody monitoring him for any efforts that he may take to radicalize other people there. And then when he's released.
Yeah, well, I'm going to keep that question more broad because,
Okay,
obviously, but I would say that individuals who are associated or the concern about continuing to promote the same type of group or same type of ideology, there's all sorts of steps that the Bureau of Prisons and law enforcement in general can take. And when Cole finishes his sentence, it's not as if he's just released and that's it. He'll be under what's called supervised release, which in the federal system is real. There's real, what we call supervision by a probation officer who will check in with him, his internet will be monitored, et cetera, and that'll exist for 3 years.
So, getting towards the end here, Atomwaffen today.
Yeah, I mean, allegedly they've disbanded. There's a public statement on that. I think that's all I'll say about that.
Okay, I won't ask the next question I was going to ask. Questions from the audience. And I'll pull up my pad here.
Governor, it looks like we have something up here.
Mr. Cohen?
Thank you, Governor. Not directly related to this case.
No.
Something we've heard other people in the legal profession talk about this summer has been using civil suits directed at groups like Atomwaffen as a tactic. What's your thought about that?
I think that you have to look at the composition. I think to answer that question, I would say I would start with the composition of a group like this. These are almost always young men. In my experience, typically young men who are either unemployed or drifting from one job to the next, not from modest means at best. Caleb Cole had a series of jobs. He didn't have sort of a stable sort of life. The power of the civil remedy, once you take away the prospect of damages, to me, I think the real cudgel, the real sort of deterrent effect is blunt. It's jail. I do think what we saw here, one of the civil remedies was the extreme risk protection order. And as a prosecutor, I'm not going to comment on policy, whether that's a good deal or a bad deal. That's for others to do, and that's not my role. But you saw the effect of it here, which is, this is a man who clearly posed a public safety risk and, had all those guns taken away.
We have a question through the QR code. Who represented Cole?
Representative Cole was a good and admirable defense attorney named Chris Black in our area. Was not an activist type defense attorney. He did a good job. I'm not a defense attorney. That's not the path I took. But I respect him, and I respect him for his role in the process. And I thought, he showed the admirable qualities of what you'd expect in a defense attorney.
My curiosity is, how long was the trial?
So the trial was short. It was about 3 days, and there were a lot of tactical decisions about that. This could have been a 2-3 week trial. And when I thought about framing this case, I knew, just having sat down with the victims, that the most powerful part of this trial was just the voices of them. The less talking I did and the more talking they did, this case was going to get stronger, and the more witnesses I called was going to dilute that message.
Chris, as a witness, I assume you were only in there when you were testifying, that you didn't get to watch the trial.
Yeah, that's right. I would have liked to have been in there for the whole thing, but you're right. I did my half an hour maybe on the stand, and that was it.
Any other questions? Ari?
It's a lot to digest, and just thank you both for your time with DOJ. I guess the first question that I have, based on what you just said, is what was the family, what was the community?
Yeah.
For a young man to travel to Europe from Seattle of modest means, there wasn't anyone in the neighborhood, anyone under the home that red flags were going off?
Yeah, I mean, I I can really only talk about sort of what's in the public record. He did have some family support. He had a family member, for example, speak on his behalf at sentencing. But in terms of untangling, who was the adult in the room who was going to either talk to law enforcement or talk sense into him or somehow get this man to go on a different path, as Chris mentioned, one of the tremendous tragedies of this is how young he was. And either that voice wasn't present or it certainly wasn't present loud enough, but I just don't really have an answer for that.
Yeah, I would say, that he was storing guns at his parents' house. That's where the police went to get him. He was manufacturing firearms at his parents' house, so-called ghost guns. He had the machine to do that, and he had some parts to do that. His grandmother was the one that testified, didn't testify, but she made a statement at sentencing that Caleb would never hurt anybody, that this seemed to be all overblown. And his grandmother's words were the most informative thing because he had a family that was really denying what he was capable of and how dangerous he is. And I think that's what he grew up in.
Question over here. Wait, he's going to bring you a microphone.
Was there any evidence that how he became radicalized?
Yeah. I wish I had that piece. And I think the best I can say from what we saw in the trial record is he had been, he was very active online. And as we've seen from so many other presentations today, and I understand that head shake, I do it too, is the internet has become a place where, I've only been a prosecutor since 2007, but I've already seen this world change, where it used to be that groups were acted and were organized much more on a local level than they are now, and it is the internet that has brought folks that are spread out throughout the country in the United States, and they have found each other and they have found a home, and it becomes this echo chamber of hateful message that reinforces itself. And so whether that was the precipitous event, I don't know, but I do know he was very active online.
There were also little warning signs in his life, even though they didn't constitute a criminal record. A girl had visited an apartment of his and gone to the local police to report that he had Nazi flags or memorabilia inside the apartment. And I think he was also known to hang out outside of like a kosher deli or something and protest or do something to disturb that business. So there were these little things that were sort of telling the story of what was to come with Caleb Cole, even probably as a teenager.
Chris, did you look into his educational background?
No, not very far, because we couldn't find out much about him. His family wasn't assisting. Your hope is, Governor, that you put the story on TV and then people call you and they lead you to water on what this person's all about. This Caleb Cole guy is still really a mystery to me. Even though he's been in this area for a while, nobody has really dropped a dime on the guy.
I assume you all know what drop a dime is. Okay. It's now what, 50-cent piece? Any other questions? Chancellor?
But before we wrap up, I'd just like to say thanks to both of you. It couldn't have been easy for you either, and society was advanced by what both of you did. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.